cannot pay transaction-based compensation, right? And transaction-based means I give you something only if that person invests in the deal. So the examples we just talked about, hey, if I bring in $500,000, you give me 1%, and if I bring in $1 million, you give me 2%. It's all contingent upon me bringing money. That's transaction-based compensation. That's the hallmark of broker-dealer activity. I don't care how active they are. That's going to be a no-no. But even if you don't do that, even if you just say, hey, look, I know you're going to bring in a lot of money, but I'm just going to pay you 5% no matter what.
Welcome to the Real Estate Mindset Podcast, hosted by Eric Nelson and brought to you by Wild Oak Capital. Eric is a real estate investor, business owner, and performance coach. Throughout this series, Eric explores the mindset behind why certain investors are so successful and how we can learn from their achievements and failures. Eric asks the tough questions around the habits, discipline, mindset, and more required to achieve the most ambitious goals. Thank you for being here and enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Real Estate Mindset Podcast. This is your host, Eric Nelson. Today I've got an awesome guest. Mauricio, thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Eric. Really looking forward to this.
So this is a cool episode because Mauricio is a syndication attorney. And so I get to blast him with questions about, what not to do, basically. But before I start, Mauricio, if you don't mind, give us kind of like your story background, what got you into this, and then what led you to kind of the syndication world.
Yeah. So I just like everybody else, I went to law school first, right? And then I did, what every law student dreams of doing. I landed a job with a pretty large law firm. I mean, that's kind of everybody's dream, not everybody's dream, but most of our dreams. And great law firm, did securities work there and a little bit of maritime because it's down here in Southern California. And great firm, but I just knew that, that wasn't for me, right? I mean, I was representing all the big securities firms, the JP Morgans, the Merrill Lynches, the Goldman Sachs, all that fun stuff. But I just knew there was something missing. It wasn't something I'm like, there's got to be something more to this, right? And luckily for me, I came across a Little Purple Book, which I'm sure a lot of your audience members have read, The Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And that really changed my whole mindset, changed my whole way of thinking of it, changed the context that I saw everything, sort of the lenses that I saw things through. And I just realized that as great as the law firm was, I didn't want to spend the next 20 years or 50 years of my life, just getting up in the morning and going to work and killing myself and working weekends for somebody else. And so luckily, as soon as I read that book, literally a few weeks later, I'm driving down the streets of LA in my car, and I hear a drop-in from the real estate guys. And it was actually a drop-in by Robert Kiyosaki, kind of touting the real estate guys. And it was just basically a kind of a promotion for an event that they were doing down in SoCal. And if I hadn't picked up the book, if I hadn't read I hadn't read it, that thing would have meant nothing to me, right? Robert who? Like, who is this guy? Because I'd read it, because it had such an impact on me, it really resonated. Heard these real estate guys, went to check them out. Long story short, and it's a long, long story, but I went to work for them. I left the law firm, went and became their general counsel. They were doing a ton of syndications back then, a lot of real estate across the country. And that's really where I cut my teeth on the actual syndication piece. Initially kind of was general counsel and then working with the current securities attorney that they had. And so that's really where I learned a lot, and then, took that over at some point. And then they had a big following, a big sort of mentorship program. And slowly but surely, I started helping some of their members, first with some asset protection, then with some syndication. And in about 2006, I think it was 2007, I left them, kept them as a client, and started my own firm, Premier Law Group, where, when you start, you just take anything you can take and put food on the table. But as the time went on, my practice focused more and more on just syndication and asset protection for a while. And then about 8 years ago now, 7 or 8 years ago, I made the decision that I was going to go full-time syndication. So as it stands today, 100% of my practice, really of our practice, is real estate syndications. We don't do anything else. I've got a huge Rolodex and try and help my clients out as much as I can when they're looking for other types of lawyers. But we really have a very focused and specialized niche, because that's all we do is real estate syndications. And, real estate's booming, so things have been going pretty well, and I just really enjoy. It's a lot different than the law firm, because I was doing litigation in the law firm. So even though I was doing securities work, I was basically responding to complaints, lawsuits, doing depositions and trials and motions and appellate work. It's all that kind of like very sort of antagonistic kind of work. Here, what I love about this is that everybody's lined up. People who hire me are real estate syndicators. They're excited to go buy a big deal. They need me to get to the next level. And we're kind of, both of us are sort of working towards the same goal. And it's a much more fun and more relaxed, and as opposed to that litigation world where it's such not my personality, which is being a little bit antagonistic and in your face and arguing all the time. This is way more fun.
Oh, it sounds way more fun. I'm a little bit fascinated by like courtroom stuff in general, but I bet the fascination would fade pretty quickly in reality.
Yeah, look, 95% of cases settle. So we would rarely, I think I was there for 7 years. I may have done 3 trials or something. A lot of motion, so a lot of court appearances for sure. And that's kind of fun. You get out of the office, drive, do your spiel in front of the judge. But most of our stuff in the securities world anyway gets dealt in arbitration. So even if you did go to quote unquote trial, it was actually an arbitration, which is way less fun. It's you're in a boardroom or a conference room and just basically the parties and the attorneys and some arbitrator dealing with it. So you're in a conference room all day, which is not exactly the same as being in court. But so it was good. It was fun.
Right on. So I guess, before we get into all the stuff, let me just ask you personally, you've been around a bunch of real estate, right? So, yeah, I would say most of the people I know in this world have read Robert Kiyosaki's stuff. All kind of resonate with what you're saying. Do you have a personal portfolio? Do you ever kind of get involved with these deals? Are you allowed to, be a limited partner, like stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I do. Now I don't do it with my clients, right? And actually, there was a little bit of a transition period where I was also a managing partner at a mobile home park company, kind of a well-known one, and so I raised did a lot of syndications there. But at least now, as I'm working with clients, I definitely don't do any syndications. I feel like that would kind of be a conflict of interest, basically fighting for the same investors as others. But I'm certainly allowed to invest, and I do invest in other sort of an LP. And then I've got other investments as well. I'm really big on, as you can imagine, one of my big pain points are taxes because I'm a professional. So real estate is a great avenue to sort of mitigate that. But also oil and gas is just a huge tax breaks that you get from professionals, that a lot of my portfolio these days is more geared towards the oil and gas world.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool. So I think we're just going to dive right in. I think the question, if someone's looking to syndicate, really, can you kind of give us a broad stroke view of Reg D, what that means, what it is, and then of course we'll dive into 506 stuff. But if you could kind of give us the broad stuff, how did this come about? And you're the pro, so I'm pretty jazzed actually to hear this.
Yeah, let's bring it back. Let's make it as easy as to understand, because I think a lot of times, especially lawyers tend to sort of speak and they like to hear themselves speak a lot, and they don't necessarily communicate in a way that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of one of the gifts that I've been given is the ability to sort of take these esoteric and kind of complex securities matters and really distill them so that people can understand and really give the contextual view. Because again, your job's not to figure out all the statutes and know all the rules. Your job is to just kind of have enough of an idea what kind of you can and cannot do, so you can have really an intelligent conversation with your securities lawyer. So on the security side, it's actually fairly simple, big picture. Anytime you're taking money from passive investors, right, where the returns are being generated by your effort. So you're doing all the work, collecting money, you got passive investors that write you a check, and you're basically generating the returns, you and your co-sponsors, you're selling securities, right? Because a lot of people say, well, why is the SEC even involved? I'm buying a building, real estate, why is that even a part of this conversation? Why do I have to worry about SEC securities law? And it's because anytime you take money from passive investors where the returns are generated by your efforts, you are in the business of issuing securities. And it doesn't matter the structure, right? It doesn't matter if it's an LLC or a corporation or a promissory note or a tenants in common agreement or a profit sharing agreement or a handshake or high five. It really does, the structure itself is irrelevant. The SEC is going to look straight through. They're going to just look, are you doing all the work? And do you have passive investors writing you a check? And if that's the case, you're issuing securities. And when you realize that, there's only, in my world, there's only 3 things that we need to worry about or be concerned about. Number 1 is we either have to register that security with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which we never want to do. Or number 2, we find an exemption to that registration. Or number 3, it's illegal. You register, you find an exemption, or it's illegal. And so registration is going public. You don't have time for that. You don't want to deal with that. That's going to cost you a lot of money, 6 figures plus. It's going to take you 12, 18, 24 months to get through the system. You're under contract. You got to close in 90 days or 120 days. You don't have time to do any of that nonsense, right? So registration's almost always off the books, off the list. Obviously, we don't want to do anything illegal. But illegal doesn't necessarily mean Bernie Madoff stuff. It doesn't. I mean, obviously, it does mean Bernie Madoff stuff. If you're ripping off your investors and using the investor funds to go, fund your luxury lifestyle, that's going to be a problem. But it can also be sort of maybe more accurately described as non-compliant, right? If you're relying on an exemption, which we'll talk about in a second, if you're relying on an exemption that does not allow you to advertise, for example, and you go out and advertise, well, that's going to be an illegal offering. Or if you fail to disclose all the important information to your investors, if that's required, that's going to be a non-compliant or illegal syndication. So don't think, oh, well, I'm not going to do anything illegal. I'd never defraud someone. Good, but that's not the only thing. So we're always trying to find that number 2, which is we're always looking for what's the exemption that we need to find and work on so that we don't have to rely on a registration. And we also obviously don't want to be doing anything illegal. And that's where all these kind of things that you've heard of, that you mentioned, Reg D is by far the most popular exemption, and within Reg D, there's really those 2 that I think we're about to mention, which is this is about as technical as we're going to get, but Rule 506B as in boy, 506B and 506C. Those are the 2 rules underneath Reg D, Regulation D, that are hands down the most popular exemptions. I mean, if you talk to any syndicator, 95% of the time they're going to be talking about 506B or 506C, even though there are others out there. So don't think that those are the only 2 options. There's a Reg A out there. There's 504. There's intrastate. Sort of everything happens in one state. There's a bunch of them out there, but for reasons we can discuss, these have become hands down the most popular exemptions, and it's probably easy to see why once you start going through the rules that these 2 apply.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, awesome. I agree. Like, that was amazing top level view, is like, why is the SEC involved? Oh, it's because you're selling securities. And then, let's find an exemption, because we don't really want to necessarily file, right? So right. Love it. So let's dive a little deeper. I mean, I know you said you don't want to get terribly technical. I don't either, but 506B versus 506C. And then I have a handful of questions kind of for each.
Yep, let's talk about 506B first, because that's the oldest one, the one that's been around the longest. It used to just be called 506 until 506C came around, and then we added the B to this. But 506B allows you, first of all, to raise an unlimited amount of money. There's no cap, right? So even when you see the big boys, the JP Morgans, Merrill, the Goldman Sachs, or the Blackstone is really a big one. Even though they're raising, I mean, the Blackstone one I saw was they did a real estate fund, and it was $26 billion fund. 26 billion, right?
That's an insane number.
I went in there and I checked out the offering, and just the amount of money that went to broker dealers was staggering, as you can imagine. Whatever percentage of $26 billion, I think it was like 300 and something million. It was just some crazy number. But anyway, those are all 506Bs, because you can raise an unlimited amount of money. Now, most of us won't get anywhere close to 26 billion, but whatever you need to raise, this is available for you. You can take a limited number of non-accredited investors. And that's probably one of the reasons it's very popular, which is non-accrediteds are, well, the opposite of accredited. So it's probably easier to define what an accredited investor is. And if you're not an accredited, then you're obviously non-accredited. An accredited investor is anyone who has $1 million in net worth, excluding their primary residence, right? And that was added I think it was added, I forget exactly how long ago, but that was because all the Californians were all accredited once the housing boom of 2004, 5, and 6. So they excluded the primary residence. Or on the income side, if you've earned $200,000 a year the past 2 years, with a reasonable expectation of earning that much or more this year, you're also an accredited investor. And if you want to combine that with your spouse, that number actually goes up to 300,000. And then they've updated the accredited investor rule, which we can talk about a little bit later on. Not super earth-shattering, but now if you have some licenses, for example, if you're a registered investment advisor, or you have a Series 65 or a Series 82 or Series 7, then you're also accredited. And there's promises of more to come. But right now, those are kind of the main things. And the nice thing about 506B is that it does allow you to take up to 35 non-accredited investors, which is really important, especially for new syndicators. They want to have their friends and family, and inevitably, Uncle Bob is not accredited, or your brother, or whatever, your friends, they don't happen to be accredited. And so having that ability to take non-accredited investors is very, very appealing. The main drawback, or the main limitation of this whole rule, is you're not allowed to advertise, or generally solicit. And then the difference is, if generally soliciting for me would be, you can't go to a meetup or a conference or a seminar and just start passing out your business plan or start, pitching deals to people you don't know, right? You have to have what's called a pre-existing substantive relationship, kind of a technical term. But if you have a pre-existing relationship and it's substantive, then you're fine. You can pitch them your deal. But if you just met them at an event or a meetup or on Zoom or whatever, then you don't have a substantive relationship. You've got to go about getting one and establishing that relationship before you can start offering anything. So that's general solicitation. Then obviously advertising, obviously you can't run ads, or not that you're going to run ads in the newspaper anymore, but social media is a big one. Like, a lot of people are posting stuff on social media, which, if it crosses the line, that's a form of advertising. If you're on social media, if you post stuff on your website, that's public, so that would be considered advertising. If you're on a podcast like this, if I had a fund or I was raising money right now and you and I were chit-chatting and I'm like, oh yeah, by the way, Eric, I'm raising some money, if you're interested, give me a call, that would be advertising. So that's the main limitation of 506B. And then the last thing I want to mention is that there's no verification, really. You get to sort of rely on their representation. They tell you they're accredited, they check the box, you can reasonably rely on that. So that's kind of 506B. And before I go to 506C, the reason it's popular is really twofold. One is it provides certainty. Like, if you comply with those things that I've just gone through, and there's a couple more, but those are the main ones, then you're assured of compliance. It's a safe harbor. It's what we call a safe harbor, meaning we don't have to, sit there and debate. It's not a reasonable stand. Like, if you hit these points, you're good. There's no guesswork. But more importantly, I think the reason this is very popular, as well as 506C, which we'll talk about in a second, is that it preempts the states. And preemption is just a fancy word for saying we don't have to worry about the state statutes. Because if you can imagine, you're doing a syndication, this is all federal law, right? If you're doing a syndication and you have an investor in California and you have an investor in Texas and you have an investor in Florida, and I got the federal rules, number one, I'd have to go, if there was no preemption, I'd have to go hire a lawyer in each of those states to make sure I'm complying with those specific state statutes, securities law statutes. So that's an expense, and then you got to talk to them, which is even worse. And then second of all, you have to make sure that your offering fits into those 4 or 5, or if you've got more investors from different states, you may have 10 different statutes that you're trying to sort of structure your deal so it doesn't violate any of those statutes. And so the time and expense involved in that is just off the charts. And so these preempt the states, which means, other than defrauding, the anti-fraud provision, other than being Bernie Madoff, I don't have to worry about each specific statute in each specific state. And that's a huge deal. This is why 506B is super popular. 506C is super popular. Interestingly, Reg A, which not really relevant to many of us, but Reg A, nobody used to use Reg A until they passed an update. And one of the updates was it preempted state law. So now we don't have the same thing with Reg A. So now Reg A has become a little bit more popular. But that's really why these are so popular compared to you may hear other rules and you may say, wait a minute, that seems like a cool 504, for example, is a great example. 504 sounds interesting because I don't have to do this, I don't have to do that. And my answer is always, so yeah, but you got to go hire a lawyer in 5 different states now, because yes, it's easy on the federal level, but now it doesn't preempt the states, which is a big deal. So anyway, that was kind of a long-winded thing there. 506C is almost identical with 2 critical, I call them pivot points, because you're going to pivot based on these 2 factors. One is advertising. So 506C allows you to advertise and generally solicit. So if you come to me and say, Mauricio, I want to advertise my offering, well, there's my pivot point. I can't do 506B because it's prohibited. So I'm going to have to do, between those 2 anyway, I have to do 506C. So that's going to be my first question. How are you going to get your investors? Are they people you already know? Or is this something that you want to go and go on podcasts and, maybe you have a big audience already and you want to, for example, you're the host of Bigger Pockets, you've got a huge audience, boom, you can fill up your offerings pretty quickly. But
which they just recently did in like 2 hours.
That's exactly right. They're a client of ours, and it's ridiculous how quickly they can raise the money. But if you're not going to advertise and you want to go with your friends and family, then so that's the first pivot point, is whether they're accredited or not. And then whether the advertising or not. The second one is accreditation. If you're planning on taking non-accredited, then you're going to have to go 506B, because 506C does not allow for non-accredited. You can only accept accredited investors, and you can't take their word for it. You have to take what's called reasonable steps to verify that they're accredited. Right? Everything else is the same. Unlimited amount of money, It preempts state law, but you cannot take 35 non-accredited. You can only take accredited. You've got to take reasonable steps to verify, and you can advertise. So, even between those two, though, the SEC statistics are kind of crazy. They're almost, I think, 93-7. So 93% of people still use 506B versus only 7% use 506C. I would say in my practice, which I'm actually in the process of actually documenting, because this is sort of anecdotal off the top of my head, I would say probably 75% of my clients use 506B and 25% use 506C, with C climbing rapidly. Like, I think more and more people are either getting more comfortable with it, or probably what's happening is they're kind of running out of, their existing groups already. They're running out of money. They're tapped out. There's no more money in that group, and so they've got to expand that net. And the best way to go and expand a net is through Facebook, through meetups, through all that kind of stuff that people want, podcasts, everything that people want to do.
So a couple of questions about each of these. I mean, I think, first of all, thank you for the overview, because that was perfect. Like, that's such a good look at the differences between the two. So, I'm kind of I'm an engineer, so I'm always like, what's worst case scenario? Kind of like, So what I was going to ask was like, 506B, I see people posting on social media, won't say names. And I'm like, that seems a little bit fishy.
Yeah. John does it all the time.
Yeah. So a couple things. The first question would be, let's say you post on social media, let's say you get some people interested, blah, 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 you close the deal, cruise through. I guess let's talk about worst case scenario. I mean, the SEC maybe not going to come hunt you down. Is it usually like when the deal goes bad, or usually when are you seeing the SEC get involved?
Yeah. Worst case scenario is you're going to jail.
That's a terrible case.
No, I'm not. No, it's funny. I wrote an ebook called The 5 Things Every Syndicator Must Know to Stay Out of Jail. And I start the ebook like, it's not the odds of, you're not going to go to jail, like, unless you're Bernie Madoff, right? Which, if you're defrauding investors and you're taking their money and you're literally going out and buying cars and vacations, then yes, jail's in the cards for you. But if you're posting on social media or inadvertently do something, or it wasn't really intentional, and you just whatever, maybe you weren't allowed to take any non-accrediteds and you took a couple, things like that, then really what you're doing is you're being non-compliant, right? And the worst case scenario there is still pretty drastic, and it's serious, which is why I wrote that ebook title, because I wanted people to understand that it's serious, because I think people were being very cavalier with it. As you mentioned, people are posting all the time, even though they know they shouldn't. And I think the attitude is, well, everybody's doing it, so why don't I? So I wanted to kind of get people's attention and say, look, there are some serious consequences. The main consequences is rescission. So I always say the worst, which is just basically you've got to give your investors their money back plus interest. So the way I see it is, if you're doing a non-compliant offering, you're essentially guaranteeing your investors' returns, because even if the deal goes south, even if it was no fault of your own, let's say there was just another great financial crisis and whatever, you needed to refinance and you couldn't do it, and it really wasn't your fault, but you were non-compliant, well, guess what? You've got to return all your investors. So if an investor gave you $100 grand, you're going to give investors $100,000 back plus interest, right? And guess what? You probably don't have it, right? Probably because the deal's gone south, you don't have it. And so what happens? You're going to file for bankruptcy. It's going to go downhill. And I guarantee you're going to be prohibited from ever raising money ever again, because one of the things we didn't talk about, little nuances on both 506B and 506C, is you can't have any quote unquote bad actors as sponsors. And so if you're being nailed with a non-compliance, whether it's a settlement or judgment, you're going to become a bad actor and you're going to be prohibited. So that's the worst case scenario from the consequences. But you're right. Typically, not always, but typically, the way these things go south is an investor complains, right? They pick up the phone and they actually they may call the SEC, but it's actually the state regulator that really is the one that's most interested, because, as I mentioned before, the feds have kind of stripped away all of their powers because it preempts state law. So I always joke that they're sitting there twiddling their thumbs without anything to do. So whenever they have something that they think is going on, if they get a call from an investor, they're pretty excited to go after, at least go take a look at it and see if it's something they want to do. But it usually starts with an investor complaining. So I've always thought that, yeah, as long as everything's going great, you're relying on that golden rule defense. So everything's great, you're good. But the minute things start to level off, where, because right now you could probably throw a dart at the dartboard, right? And everything's going to go great. But at some point when, prices level off or prices go down, and you've overpaid for the property, or, all those things that can go wrong, that's when people, don't start getting the returns. They start getting bad news from the sponsors. They pick up the phone, they call. That's when they open up an investigation. It's an audit. They'll request all the docs. They'll start talking to investors, and that's where it can start snowballing pretty quickly. But, there's been some SEC investigations in the last couple of years before any of this has happened. This is pre-COVID, so this is before any kind of little issues may have popped up, and it had to do more with another non-compliant issue that happens a lot, which is paying referral fees, right, or paying somebody a piece of the pie, like a piece of the GP, in order to help them bring in capital, right? So you can't pay anybody to raise money for you unless that person is a licensed broker dealer. But that happens a lot, and in fact, the SEC went after a few people based on that, and that was when things are going well. So it doesn't. So don't assume that it has to go bad for something to happen. But you are essentially guaranteeing the returns at that point. And again, if somebody's complaining, it probably means the deal isn't going well. It probably means you're not going to have $2 million to give everybody their money back if the deal goes south, which means you're filing for BK and you're basically out of business.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty terrible situation.
Yeah.
So I'm going to walk down this road a little bit more. I don't want to go too far in the weeds here, but have you seen, I do want to circle back to raising capital too, but have you seen people get busted on social media? Like, that seems to be the most egregious to me. I mean, I see it all the time, people posting stuff. I'm like, that just seems like solicitation. Again, everyone's doing it. I'm just maybe overly cautious. I don't want to be involved with that, but have you seen the SEC kind of go after that type of activity?
First of all, just to be fair, just because you're seeing it, they could be 506C deals, right? So unless they're a 506B or there's some reference to, and that's a good way to find out. Like you could do a reply to them like, hey, do you take non-accrediteds? And if they, oh yeah, they're welcome, then it's a 506B and it's a violation. But it could legitimately be a 506C. I always recommend, if you're going to do that, to somehow do a little asterisk and let them know, hey, accredited investors only, or this is a 506C, so that you don't even get people riled up, or even regulators potentially looking at that. So it just makes it very clear. Oh man, I totally lost my train of thought of that. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, if you've seen people crack down on.
Oh, I have not. Sorry, I have not seen. No, and I haven't. And I think the reason for that is because things have gone so well for the last. I mean, we haven't had a downturn for 13 years, right? And if you think about what social media looked like 13 years ago, it was around, but it certainly wasn't at the level. And so we haven't seen anything, even any what we call no action letters or any sort of guidance specifically about social media and what's good and what's not. I think once things start going south and people start getting nailed for it, you'll start to see a little bit more guidance on people getting I say prosecuted, but getting into trouble. And again, there's no debate. I mean, the SEC has said that, posting on social media is just like putting an ad in the newspaper. So to the extent, and your website, by the way, don't forget your website's public. So that's getting blasted to the entire world. So you gotta be very, very careful. My recommendation to clients is, if you have an active deal, just stay off of social media. Like there's times to do it, but not when you have an active deal. I mean, you can post about your kids and your cats and all that fun stuff, but I would stay away from being too cute about trying to just post something, because it gets very, it's very gray, and especially if you're not usually posting. Like I always draw when I'm doing presentations, kind of a bell curve. Like if you have no activity on social media, and then a week or two before an offering, suddenly there's an increase in activity, right? And you're posting all kinds of stuff, and then once the deal closes, you're back down to zero. That doesn't look good either. So if you're going to post, make sure you're consistent, at least, so you can argue that it wasn't specifically for this. But I would just stay off. I mean, the time to use social media, the time to add people to your list in general, I think, is when you're in between deals. You don't have anything to offer. You're meeting people through meetups, seminars, webinars, whatever. You're having phone calls and coffee, and just really entering into real relationships with people, so that you establish that substantive relationship. And then the minute you have a substantive relationship, well, great. Now they're eligible for your next deal, because you have to have a pre-existing substantive relationship, which means pre-existing the offering. So once your offering starts, you can't really take any. If you're doing a 506B, you can't take anybody that you don't already know.
Awesome. Well, I guess one time that I see social media being somewhat powerful is like we close the deal. So we close, we own it. What I want to do is basically say, hey, close this deal. If you missed out, like reach out type thing, like let us know, and then we want to get to know you, and so that we can let you know about the next one type thing. Is that like, I'm just asking a pointed question, because that's something I want to do. You think
Yeah,
that that's
it's
okay?
dangerous. It's a great, it's funny. I bring that as an example all the time. I always say there's things you clearly can do, clearly you cannot do, and there's this gray area. And I think that's one of them. One of the things that I think people need to understand when they're posting on social media is that, yes, you can't obviously post about your deal. That I think that's obvious. You can't say, hey, I'm raising $1 million to buy this apartment building. If you're interested, call me. That doesn't work. But there's also something called conditioning the market. So that's also considered an offer by the SEC, which means anytime you post something that kind of drums up interest about your current deal, your future deal, that may, which is the gray area, may be considered conditioning the market. So that post in and of itself is kind of, to me, if I had my way, I would have my clients not do it because, what's the purpose of that post, right? The purpose of the post is to kind of get people excited. I'm like, oh, this guy closed, maybe I should pick up the phone, call him and find out. And if you do something like that, where you're actually flat out coming out and saying, hey, if you missed out on this one, give us a call, I think that can be attributed as conditioning the market, especially if you have another deal around the corner. Right. If you don't raise anything for another 2 years, then I don't think that post is going to come back and haunt you. But if you make that post and a week later you're out there, with your next deal, that's going to be an issue. And another thing I've seen on those posts, which you really want to be careful about, is that you have to understand there's a difference between closing the offering and closing the property. It's not uncommon for you to close on the property, but still need to continue to raise a little bit of money. Maybe you need another 50 grand or 100 grand because you decided like, oh, I don't need my acquisition fee now, but I need to close today and I'll raise the next 50 grand tomorrow. Well, again, the minute you make that post, yeah, you've closed on the property, but your offering is still technically open. And so that next person that comes in, that to me would be a condition, not only conditioning the market, that would actually be a blatant violation of the advertising rules for that last person or two that come in.
Oh, I love it. That's such a good tip. I mean, for me, that's like, for everyone listening who's a syndicator, I mean, that's a huge deal because you see that post quite a bit. I mean, I really appreciate your honesty because I think it's like, that's kind of a gray area. Clearly want to stay away from that, especially kind of like the give us a call on the next deal. I mean, it doesn't sound like that's any good. And then if your offering's not closed, even if the property's closed. So such good tips. I guess, what else are you seeing? I guess I'm kind of walking down a dark road here, but what else are you seeing people do? Or actually, before I get there, let's go back to the raising capital thing, because I think, again, I do see this, I'm being totally honest, is people will say, hey, I'll bring $500,000 for a couple of points of the GP. And honestly, it scares me to even have that email in my inbox. And I always reply just like, not saying no, but let's be crystal clear. You got to be an active partner. And that, that kind of piece of the pie, I'm sure you see it all the time. So can you kind of touch on the rules there and then, what to do to avoid that?
Yeah, that one's not even gray. So that one's blatant. I think that's why the SEC started going after some of these people, because you're right. Because people, I think they just don't know. So you literally do get, because they get forwarded to me all the time, that you literally get emails from people saying, hey, I can bring in $500,000 to your deal. And if I bring in $500,000, can you give me 1% of the GP? And if I bring in more, can you give me more? And that's just blatant broker dealer activity. So the rule is fairly simple. If you want to raise capital or pay somebody to raise capital for you, they have to be licensed. They have to be licensed. They have to be a broker dealer, a licensed, not a real estate agent, not a real estate broker, an SEC licensed broker dealer. Just like you can't practice law without a license. You can't practice medicine without a license. You can't go raise money without a license. So that's number one. So it's generally understood that if you're the only one raising money, right, for your own deal, then obviously you're not raising money for others, right? You're raising money for your own deal, and even if you're going through an LLC, it's pretty common knowledge that that's not going to be broker dealer activity because you're not raising money for somebody else. But if you're the GP or the manager or an agent or an employee or somebody that's not the actual LLC, which it's always the case, then you're not raising money for yourself. You're raising money for that LLC. We call that the issuer, right? And so in order to get around, that's a terrible way to say it, in order to have to be exempt from the broker dealer requirement, you have to rely on what we call the issuer exemption, right? And that basically means you have, like you said, you have to be a legitimate, active co-sponsor, right? You can't just be coming in and raising money. The rule is, I break it down into 3 categories. Number one, cannot pay transaction-based compensation, right? And transaction-based means I give you something only if that person invests in the deal. So the examples we just talked about, hey, if I bring in $500,000, you give me 1%, and if I bring in $1 million, you give me 2%. It's all contingent upon me bringing money. That's transaction-based compensation. That's the hallmark of broker-dealer activity. I don't care how how active they are, that's going to be a no-no. But even if you don't do that, even if you just say, hey, look, I know you're going to bring in a lot of money, but I'm just going to pay you 5% no matter what, meaning even if I don't bring any money, you're getting 5% because you're getting 5% for everything, for all this other stuff. You have to do two things. Number one, you have to be doing what's called substantial duties, and that's a term of art that means something. That's what's in the statutes. Substantial duties, whatever the hell that means. And your primary role needs to be doing that quote unquote substantial duty. So the primary role is pretty easy because it just means 50% plus one in my book. So if you spend more time raising the money than actually doing actual work once the deal closes, then you're obviously not primarily there doing the substantial duties, you're primarily raising the money. And then substantial duties is a very slippery slope, very vague as well. Well, what exactly is substantial duties? The more you can get involved once the offering closes, the more they're involved in the deal, the more chance you have to be able to rely on that substantial duties. So don't just have them be, investor relations is a big one that people try and squeeze. There's been some guidance from the SEC that alone is not going to cut it. If you're just investor relations, that's going to be a problem. But it's a sliding scale, right? I mean, here's a great example. This is the best way I can describe it. I actually have a buddy of mine who does this. Let's say you have somebody who, works part-time for you. They're part of the GP, but they have a full-time gig. They just work on the weekends and in the evenings, and they help you with underwriting, right? They just kind of look at a bunch of markets, and then and because of that, you pay them 2%, right, of the GP, because for that work, okay? If that person brings in 50, one or two investors because they're friends of mine or whatever, and they bring in 50 grand or 100 grand, that's not going to be an issue, right? I don't see any issue with that. If that person brings in $2 million and instead of getting paid 2%, they're getting paid 30%, now it starts to look a little bit fishy, right? So it's kind of a sliding scale. So the more substantial duties you're doing versus how much money are you bringing in, the story just has to be painted properly, that you can actually make a reasonable argument that, no, I'm not getting paid for raising the money. I'm actually doing real work. I'm underwriting, or I'm asset managing, or I did the due diligence. And when I say due diligence, you got on a plane, you flew down there, you walked the units. What a syndicator does, as you know. I mean, there's so many things that you do, talking to the lawyers, talking to the CPAs, finding the property, underwriting, due diligence, asset management. So the more you can do, the less chances you have of somebody being able to argue that you were not properly involved and you did not have substantial duties. I don't know if that made any sense or not, but that's
I mean, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's really, really valuable content, because I honestly believe there's a bunch of people out there who do not know that to be a thing. Like, it's seemingly so common, and it's like, oh, I could bring 500K for whatever percent, and then it's just like, again, to me, it's like, wow, that's like, I don't know what else to do besides have this podcast, because it's so valuable for people to hear you say that. So really appreciate you.
Yeah, and I think the SEC's recognized it, because, and I'm sure some people are asking about it, so I'll touch on it briefly. But the challenge with broker dealers, although I am seeing a little bit more lately, the challenge with broker dealers is generally they don't like to get out of bed for less than 20, 30, 50 million bucks, right? They spend a lot of time culminating the list. They want to get paid. Like, they don't want to raise $1 million for you or 2 million. I am seeing more and more on those now, so they're starting to develop. But most of my clients, the average raise is 1.2 million. Most of my clients are raising 1, 2, maybe 3 million bucks. I mean, in general. So sort of most people, broker dealers, aren't really accessible. And so there's a gap, right, in order to do it properly. And that's one of the reasons the SEC came out last year with a proposed rule to sort of to kind of ease this issue that we're having, allow people to make referrals, get paid transaction-based compensation, because the reality is, for most of the syndicators, they don't have access to broker dealers. It's hard for them. So this proposed rule came out back in October. Was it October of last year? And it hasn't gone anywhere yet. I mean, we had a change in administration, so like a lot of us are now thinking it's really not going to end up passing. But there was a pretty detailed proposed rule that came out to kind of solve this problem. With the new administration, every time we call and try and get some insights from the SEC, they're basically, yeah, we'll get to it when we get to it.
Yeah, that's the tough piece of this pie. We're talking the federal government,
Right, exactly.
So any changes might be a way down the road. I did speak with another attorney about this, and he was telling me it seems like there's some social media changes on the horizon as well. And so who knows? But
I was welcoming, and I haven't seen anything yet. And again, it's all private stuff, but the SEC investigation into these money raisers. Yeah, it'd be nice to get some guidance on, what exactly is substantial duties, right? Because most of the case law or the no action letters have to do with transaction based. That's really where 99% of all the attention is on, are you getting paid transaction based compensation? If you are, then you're a broker. Not much there's not much out there with substantial duty. So I was hoping that this would kind of develop some guidance on that. And same thing with social media. It'd be great to get some guidance. Hey, these kind of posts are okay, or this doesn't violate, this rule, and get a little bit more guidance.
yeah, and I think substantive relationship is in that. It for me is like, what does that mean? You hear about seasoning, you hear about, tracking him. It's like, it's kind of this super vague thing where it's like a friend of a friend heard that you were doing this. And then you're like, okay, well, I really love to know that person. And so, my philosophy is to like really understand their financial situation, have a kind of couple coffees at minimum, and then have that relationship seasoned. I mean, that's the best way to say it. And so I can show, I know this person, I know their finances, at least to the extent I believe they won't go bankrupt if the deal goes bad, that type of thing. So I think it'd be nice to have some kind of like clearer picture there.
Well, on that one, we actually do. I will tell you, I don't know if you ever read or come across something called the Citizen VC no action letter, but that's actually one of the areas where the SEC has given us some guidance. And so you can either Google Citizen VC like venture capital. I kind of do a summary in my ebook as well, a whole chapter on what that means. But it's exactly what you said. Actually, what you just described is basically what the SEC said. And so what the SEC has said is in order to form a substantive relation, there's about 7 things you need to do, right? And the most important ones in my mind are, number 1, you send them a really detailed questionnaire, right? And not just, hey, what's your name and your favorite color, but are you accredited? Are you not accredited? What are your goals? Are you looking for growth? Are you looking for income? Are you, how old are you? What's your experience? Like, you're really trying to get to know them. Like you said, are they going to file for bankruptcy if this deal goes south? And then you want to get on a phone call or a cup of coffee or lunch or whatever to probably go over that questionnaire. And what the SEC is trying to do is they want to foster that relationship, that exchange. There's no magic 3-touch rule. There's no 30 days or whatever cooling off. It's literally they want the quality of the interactions. That's what they're looking for. And so your job as a syndicator is to talk to the investor and find out if they're sophisticated. Right. And that basically means, do they have the financial and kind of business, acumen so they can, determine the risks and the merits of your particular deal. That's kind of what a sophisticated investor would do. And then from the investor is supposed to be asking you questions to figure out what are you doing? What are your values? What kind of deals do you look for? What are you trying to do? And let's see if our interests are aligned so that we can then, enter into a relationship together. So I would check out Citizen VC. It's got the 6 or 7 steps. I think if you follow those, that tells you how to get how to get from a complete stranger to having a substantive relationship. And then once you hit that, and you got to keep records. The key here is to keep records. So every time you have a cup of coffee, take some notes, put it in your file. If you have a phone call, maybe, either take some notes, record it, transcript or whatever. But, 5 years from now, if the SEC comes to you and says, hey, Eric, how did you know Mauricio? You should be able to pull out my file and be like, oh, I met him at this event. We had a coffee, we had a phone call. I sent him this email, and you should be able to have a file that shows you that you determined, hey, today's the day that I feel like I have a substantive relationship with Mauricio.
Oh, I love it. Such good stuff. So, second part of the show, I guess we'll kind of jump to if you feel like you're done talking regulation, Mauricio, we can move to some mindset.
Yeah.
So I'll just ask you a list of questions, and I do this for every guest, and it's kind of fun. I mean, I think it's cool to see everyone's like mindset in this world, right? So first question is,
now I'm stressed and nervous. Like before I'm like easy. Now I'm like, okay.
Now you're in trial. Like now you're back in the first job.
All right.
Do you have a morning routine?
Yes. I get up ridiculously early. I've been doing that for a while. I backed off a little bit. I was getting up at 3:30, 4 a.m., 4 o'clock in the morning. A couple times I got up at like 2:30, which is obscene. But I generally get up around 4:30 now. Have my cup of coffee, and then I like to just do. I'm really big into personal development, so I'm always either watching some kind of personal development video or whatever book I'm reading at the time. And that's kind of like my first little hour, sort of hour of power. I think it's a Tony Robbins thing, that hour of power. And then, after that hour, then I kind of, get into the day a little bit and I actually always start with finances. I always go through, the business financing to start the day. But the nice thing about that is that it gets my day going, like work wise, pretty early, by 9 o'clock. I mean, I probably had a good solid, 2 or 3 hours of actual work in the door. So it just helps me. Now the downside of that is, of course, is by 4 o'clock, I'm exhausted and I'm in bed by early.
We don't have to say how early. We never give that part away. I want to ask about your evening. Kind of brings me to the next thing. Actually, you mentioned a little bit. So what books are you currently reading, or what books can you recommend?
Yeah, I'm actually rereading right now, just because we're actually about to transition a little bit. Traction by Gino Wickman, which is just an amazing book that I read about 3 years ago. It's, I think, the third time I've read it. Highly, highly recommend that if you're a business owner and you're looking to put systems in place. And it's kind of like they call it the EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. I found that I really resonate with that. So I'm rereading that. I would recommend my list of recommended books, always Rich Dad Poor Dad, obviously by Robert. I love The One Thing by Gary Keller. And then there's a book called The Slight Edge by, I think it's Steve Olson. The Slight Edge and The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy are almost identical books. I give credit to The Slight Edge because I think he wrote it first, but either one of those has it's basically the same idea, just little incremental, day and consistent the things you do just create this kind of a wedge, and just that you get exponential returns, but on your time. So those are my big business books that I typically recommend.
Love it. Cool. The next one is do you have a coach or mentor? Have you, and was it worth it?
Yeah, I've always had coaches. I've got a coach right now, Heather Christie. Shout out to Heather, who's been a great business coach for me. Been with her for 3 or 4 years and really helped me grow and scale the business. One of my biggest business mentors, it was always Jim Rohn. He, unfortunately passed away probably 10 years ago. Never met him in person, but he's all over the place. So his books and teachings, and he's kind of the precursor to Tony Robbins. But no, I would highly recommend a coach. Michael Jordan had a coach. So just because you're at the top of your game doesn't mean you don't want to have a coach. I highly recommend it. For me, it's at the point where just to bounce ideas off as well is just a great thing. A lot of times I'll have an idea and I'll pitch it, and if even if they just say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, then I feel like, okay, good, I'm in the right track. And sometimes I get pushback or feedback. So 100%. And then I do a ton of masterminds. Ton of mastermind. That's another way that it's kind of like mentorship through the group, and I'm involved in probably 3 or 4 of them, and I think they're extremely valuable.
Love it. No, I completely agree. I kind of pitch it on the show. I mean, I believe in coaching a ton. So that's why that question. I mean, it's interesting to hear all walks of life, say, yeah, I've had a coach or mentor, whatever it might be. So yeah, completely love it. So next question is there anything you've done in your career? You don't have to go too and far into detail, but something that you would not repeat that we can learn from.
Career-wise, I actually wrote a chapter in a book about it too. I had a major medical scare about 3 years ago, 2018. And I was a one-man show back then. It was literally me, and I had a sort of a contract lawyer, but I was a one-man show. And so when I ended up, I basically was in the hospital for 6 months in and out, basically got hit by a bus, and I didn't get hit by a bus, but I was basically out for 6 months. And, even though everybody was super understanding, just being the sole point of failure was something I'll never do again. The minute I got back on my feet and started building everything back, and the first thing I did was build a team, and that's where I'm at now. And that's why the traction things, I'm trying to bring in somebody else to kind of run the business side of it. But I built my team up from basically 0 now to 9, and I would never go back to being sort of a solopreneur or single point failure, because number one, you grow much better with a team anyway. But if anything ever happens to you, you just got to be able to make sure you're taking care of not only your family but your clients and everything like that. So big takeaway there was just don't put that. And it was on my list to do for a long time. I got to build a team. I'll get to it. And you're so busy working in the business. E-Myth's another great book. You're working in the business as opposed to working on the business, that I would never go back to just being a one-man show. So if you're in that position, I highly recommend getting a partner, putting a team together, and putting systems together so that if you got hit by a bus or decided to go on vacation for a year, the business can continue to run. I think Dan Kennedy calls it a sustainable company, that it actually not only continues to work, but actually may even grow if you step away for a year.
Yeah, that's hard to do. So that's such good
Yeah.
advice though.
Yeah.
Because I had kind of a similar situation. I mean, I own an engineering company. I have a partner. He's awesome. And it was like kind of this leap to like partner, right? And then with real estate is even worse. I was buying properties with my wife. She was not terribly interested. I mean, of course, she's amazing, like partner life-wise, but not exactly a business partner. So, but I had this like limiting belief, kind of like I could do it on my own, blah, blah, blah. And it took my coach to push me to partner. And what I've learned is it's so much better to have a few people around you, that you can rely on, bounce ideas and all this stuff. So awesome tip. I love that.
Well, team, the real estate guys always said team stands for together, everyone achieves more, which I thought was always a great little slogan. But, and you owe it not only to like I said, to yourself, your family, but if you're a syndicator, think about that. If you're a syndicator and you're a solopreneur, single point failure, and you do get hit by a bus tomorrow, who's going to take care of all the properties and the investors? What's your plan of your succession plan? And obviously for your family as well, you need to have some. So having a team just helps do that, because if you get hit by a bus, well, you got your partner who can step in.
I sincerely hope neither one of us get by a bus. It does happen. I mean,
it does happen.
That's exactly why it's in place.
Something happens, you got, especially now with COVID going on. I mean, what if you're out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month because maybe everything ends up being okay, but you're out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. What happens to, life goes on, business continues to go on. And so having a team and somebody you trust and another partner is just invaluable when it comes to those situations.
Yeah, completely agree. Awesome. So the next one is what mindset tip? And I love that you're into personal development, so maybe this won't be easy for you, but what mindset tip can you share for our listeners?
Oh man, there's so many of them. What's a good one? Limiting beliefs is a great one. You mentioned it just now. Most of us, and me included, I mean, and that's one of the reasons I love having a coach, is because I'll say something and I'll be like, that's just not true. That's a limited belief you have in your mind. So just be aware of it. I think self-awareness is a big thing. So just be aware of that when you're thinking those thoughts. It's just a limiting belief. Abundance mentality is another thing that I believe in a lot. Just because there's no reason why win-wins. If there's no reason why because somebody else is doing something that somehow has to detract from you. I mean, there's abundance all over the place, and I think having an abundance mentality goes a long way. I was taught that at an early age, but I think those are kind of probably my two big ones.
Yeah, I mean those are awesome. So I won't even comment. I love that stuff.
I feel like 2 hours from now I'm going to come up with all these other ones, and I should have said that one. I should have said the other one, but you're putting me on the spot.
I know, that's what's kind of fun though. Like put you on the spot, and then maybe you'll think about it later. You can shoot me a text or something.
Yeah.
Cool. So these are the hardest ones in my opinion. The hardest question is, what is your definition of success?
Well, that's an easy one for me because I steal it from Jim Rohn, and it's a little bit difficult to unpack, but I'll say it and then I'll kind of describe it. Jim used to say that success is the continual unfolding of the design of your own life and pulling it off. Meaning that success is different for everyone, right? Like if your definition of success is Jim's quote, if your definition of success is to retire to the mountains and spend the rest of your life feeding the squirrels, and you do that, then you're a smashing success, because you had a goal, you had a dream, and you spent developing that dream over time. So it's just you have a dream, you're unfolding that dream, and you're getting to whatever you define as successful. So success is a continual unfolding of the design of your own life and pulling it off.
Oh man, so good. That's honestly, I think that might be my favorite, even though you stole it. I still think it's like my favorite response ever. So that's so good, because it's absolutely true. And that's why I love the question, is because everyone has a different definition, and what I always say is, it's not money. And if someone were to say that in the post show, I might be like, hey man, none of my business, but money does not mean success. But luckily no one said that so far.
But hey, look, but you know what? But if you want the car and that's what you want, and you put your mind to it and you pull it off, then in my mind, you're a success. But for many of us, that's not the goal, right? Your goal is to do this or do that. And so whatever it is for you, just write down your goals, right? Goal setting is a huge thing. I mean, that's a big part of personal development. Write down your goals, be very clear, come up with a plan, execute on the plan. And then when you get there, which you never will, because you'll always extend it over, but that's what makes you successful is whatever it is you want to get done. When you make it happen, you're a smashing success.
Oh yeah. And I appreciate the correction, because you're right. I mean, maybe that is someone's success. So love it.
Yeah.
Cool. And then the second part to that is, if someone asks you, why are you successful and others maybe not so much, maybe it comes back to definition, but what is your kind of response there?
I think the reason I'm successful, I have thought about this, is number one, I started with a vision. I had a vision, very clear. I put a lot of thought into it. I figured out kind of the design, like here's what I wanted to do. I kind of had the end in mind. So you always start with the end in mind. You got to have that vision, and you got to have a goal, right? And that's why goal setting is so important. And then you've got to just execute on that plan that you have. And I think without a vision, without goals, you can just spend your whole life kind of drifting here and there and not really get somewhere. But to me, having those goals and the vision, they're almost like, as Jim used to say, they're kind of a magnet, the magnet of the future, pulling you towards the future. And I think that's been a huge factor, that the personal development, the goal setting, and getting rid of my limiting beliefs, I think have all contributed to my success.
Man, you were crushing this mindset section, Mauricio. So, really the last thing is, how can people reach you? How can they get in touch with you? Mauricio Rauld, this has been an incredible show. I mean, for me, I really love talking to an expert, because you can just get those kind of true, clear answers. But anyway, so how can people reach you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you probably Google me around, you'll find me. I have a YouTube channel which has a lot of content that would be good for people to check out. A website, premierlawgroup.net. You can reach me over there. And then I just set up the website, stayoutofjail.com. So if you go to stayoutofjail.com, I think you're able to get that ebook. And then once you get the ebook, you'll be able to. I'll get those messages. So if you want to get in touch with me, you can always find me through those three ways. Are probably the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Yeah, ebook sounds awesome. And I love the name. I mean, so you are getting people's attention, hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mauricio. Thanks for your time.
Yeah,
I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Real Estate Mindset Podcast. If you've enjoyed the content today, please follow this show wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to head over to wildoakcapital.com for more information or to connect with Eric directly. Please take a moment to leave a review or tell a friend about what you've listened to today. We hope you'll tune in again soon.